Two and a Half Admins, episode 171. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. How a tiny island became the global capital of cybercrime. This is Tokelau in the South Pacific, with quite a small population, but a very famous top-level domain, .tk. And anyone who's been around for a long, long time on the internet will have probably had one of these free .tk domains at some stage.
I feel like I've been around on the internet for quite some time now, and nope, sure haven't.
I had dozens of them back in the day.
Yeah, they were free, at least for a year. Why not?
Yeah, I used them a lot for IRC virtual hosts and things like that, because I had all the IPs where I controlled the reverse DNS. So they were quite valuable.
I had my sweet website that I made in Dreamweaver for my band at the time in the late 90s, and I needed a domain to put it on. So, hey, this is free. Let's use this.
Well, because I remember before that, before the .com bust, there was Domain Zero, where if you subscribed to enough magazines, they would give you a .com for free.
Huh.
Like, use your own name servers and control it, like, entirely. All you had to do was basically jack up the numbers for these magazines so the advertisers would have to pay the magazines more.
I can't remember for sure. Was Domain Zero like an offshoot of Net Zero?
No, but there was a different version first called Name Zero that was, we'll give you the .com for free, but we're putting a banner ad frame across the bottom of it as the price. And then Domain Zero was, no, we give you control of the .com. But it wasn't related to Net Zero, which was free dial-up internet.
I mean, if you're giving me the domain name, best of luck figuring out how to slap a banner across my website.
Well, so with Name Zero, it was, we control the domain, and then we'll load your other website in a frame. And yeah, guess what? I know the JavaScript to bust out of a frame.
Yeah, I remember doing quite a bit of that back in the 90s. You know, you get with the sketchy-ass free web host, the tripod or whatever, and inserting the JavaScript to break their little inserts. It'll still be there in the source. Like, you view the source and, all of their stuff is still there. You just broke it.
Well, anyway, Tokelau were assigned this .tk and didn't even know about it in the early days of the internet. And so a Dutch entrepreneur said to them, let me run it for you and I'll give you a cut. And they said, okay. And so his great plan was give everyone a year's free domain and run ads on it. And then if they want to keep it after that, charge them for it. And surprise, surprise, people took advantage of this, not just dumb kids like me making a band website, but people using it to host all sorts of nefarious shit. And so now Tokelau has got this terrible reputation, or at least their domain has, as just being tied to cybercrime and just bad activity on the internet. And they're not overly happy about that.
I'll be honest with you, despite the fact that I've been on the internet for pretty much as long as there's been an internet, available at all to normal people. I actually, until this story broke, I was unaware that you had been able to get free .tk domains. I didn't know that history of it. I'd never had any myself. I just noticed, exactly that. Oh, God, .tk stuff. Run. It's kind of like .biz domains. I think everybody learned .biz. If it says .biz on the end, that's not really where you want to go. That's not going to be a good click. And .tk basically got the same reputation, and for the same reasons, because it wasn't a good thing to click generally.
Yeah, and it's ended up on loads of block lists, just star.tk essentially.
Well, after you've, blocked McDonald's.tk and Starbucks.tk and Wendy's.tk and, a laundry list of whatever else, very, very well-known things that absolutely are not on the .tk top-level domain, eventually you just go, if there's a baby somewhere in all that bathwater, I kind of stopped caring, and you chuck it out the back of the carriage.
So in December of 2022, courts in the Netherlands found in favor of investors who are suing Freenom, the company that manages .tk and other top-level domains for small countries like Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and the Central African Republic, and Mali.
Yeah, and as a result of all that, you can't get a free TK anymore. And so things are a little bit up in the air for this small island nation.
There is one brief excerpt from the MIT Technology Review piece on the .tk debacle that I want to read for everybody. It was obvious from the start that this was not going to turn out well, says Levine, co-author of The Internet for Dummies. The only people who want these domains are crooks. Levine says that .tk had started attracting unsavory characters almost immediately. The cost of the domain name is tiny compared to everything else that you need to do to set up a website, so unless you're doing something weird that actually needs lots of domains, which usually means criminals, then the actual value in free domains is insignificant, he says. This really resonated with me, both the first bit and the second bit. For one thing, I couldn't get over the humor of, getting the Internet for Dummies guy to weigh in on why this was obviously a bad idea. But in the second part, we were just talking about how, despite the fact that I've been on the internet, I bought my first domain in the mid-1990s, but the whole free.tk domain thing just never really made an impression on me. I didn't even realize it was a thing. And Levine actually hit the nail on the head there. It's not that I wasn't buying domains. I was. It was just that, if you only have, even if you've got like 10, 20, 30, 40, hell, 50 of them, if you're only paying somewhere between, say, $15 and $50 a year per, it just doesn't add up to much money if you're actually, supporting yourself with any kind of a margin to begin with. So yeah, the value of the free domains is pretty marginal when you already have enough disposable income to have 10 joke domains that you bought that you never did anything with and never will.
Yeah, I think part of it is they see some other successful ones, like the island of Tuvalu with its .tv is apparently getting 10% of its annual GDP from domain sales. And Micronesia's .fm is quite popular with radio stations and podcasts. At the same time, .ai is suddenly a lot more interesting than it was before. And the Caribbean island of Anguilla is really trying to market into that. But at the same time, we've also seen Tongos.to be favored more and more by torrent and illegal streaming websites or other unsavory things. And a 2016 study by the Anti-Phishing Working Group found that at that time, about 75% of all malicious domains were .tk, .com, .cc, or .pw. Although without separating out .com from the numbers, it's hard to say whether alternative domains have any real impact.
Yeah, that's surely skewing the numbers hardcore there, because .com is by far the most popular. Everyone wants that.
Well, and also, if you're trying to phish people and you're trying to get people that know anything about the internet, your .com is going to look a lot better than a .pw.
Yeah, exactly. PAYPA1.com, for example, is going to look a lot better than PayPal.tk.
I know you're supposed to go for the .com as the gold standard, but I've always honestly felt a little uncomfortable with it for most of the things I actually want to do a website for, because the .com is short for commercial. So it always felt kind of weird having a .com for, a personal blog or heck, a tech blog, just basically anything you didn't have an actual monetization plan for. I was like, okay, why am I lying and making this sound ickier than it actually is?
Because Control-Enter, that's why.
I kind of like .net, honestly.
Yeah. It was only supposed to be for providers and so on. But yes, I spent a bunch of time even at my previous company. The .com website is where we sell you stuff, and the .net is where all the server names and stuff are. Mm-hmm. All the infrastructure is on the .net domain, and the commercial stuff is on .com.
I find it weird when people have a .org and it's not a charity, because you don't need to be anymore. You haven't been for ages and ages, but it seems weird if you're running like a company off a .org.
Yeah. Although there's a difference between a nonprofit organization and a charity, but yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. But if it's like just a straight up for-profit company off a .org, that just seems very odd to me.
Mm-hmm. It was never actually a hard requirement, though.
Wasn't it?
Nope.
Oh, right.
I actually managed to secure contracting.org for a residential construction company back in the 90s. Was incredibly proud of myself. It was the late 90s. It was already essentially impossible to get a common English single word domain name. So even with .org instead of .com, I was like, man, this is a win. But guy decided he didn't like it, and he went to a domain name that was literally 4 times as long that he thought was better because it had his entire company name in it, which ended in contracting. So that gives you some ideas, like name contracting. Huh. Actually, technically, it was name general contracting.
Oh, wow.
Terrible. So terrible choice for the domain name, and he just let contracting.org sit for a couple of 3 years as like a secondary alias, and then he sold it off to somebody. And it's just like, man, I don't know what you were thinking.
He probably made a fair few bucks off that domain, to be fair.
Maybe. I suspect he probably got a few grand for it, but he still sold it early enough. I don't think he probably got what it was really worth.
Right.
The domain is currently for sale with just your regular parking site on it, so nobody made a lot of money off it, I don't think.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. If you work in security or IT and your company has Okta, this message is for you. Have you noticed that for the past few years, the majority of data breaches and hacks you read about have something in common? It's employees. Hackers absolutely love exploiting vulnerable employee devices and credentials, but it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where only secure devices can access your cloud apps. In this world, phished credentials are useless to hackers, and you can manage every OS, even Linux, from a single dashboard. Best of all, you can get employees to fix their own device security issues without creating more work for IT. The good news is, you don't have to imagine this world. You can just start using Kolide. Kolide is a device trust solution for companies with Okta, and it ensures that if a device isn't trusted and secure, it can't log into your cloud apps. So support the show and visit kolide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Passive SSH server private key compromise is real for some vulnerable gear. This got me worried until I read a little bit more into it and realized that it's not quite the big deal that I thought it was at first.
Yeah, so they found a way where by looking at how an SSH server responds when there's some bits flipped, that eventually they might be able to recover the private key. Then when they looked a bit further, they went back to some scan data they have for about 5 billion SSH records and looking at all of their observations and seeing which ones might be recoverable. And they said maybe 4,900 of those flawed signatures revealed the factorization of the corresponding RSA public key, which they used to derive the original private key. And they only recovered 189 of those public keys.
More importantly yet, and I feel like this is the thing that most of our listeners are going to be immediately concerned about when they hear this, you're not vulnerable if you're running OpenSSH on a proper Linux box. This is not an OpenSSH vulnerability. This appears so far to be limited to SSH implementations that are found in simpler embedded gear, especially read IoT-grade garbage.
Right, so stuff that was vulnerable anyway.
Yeah, now, to be fair, I would also definitely be concerned about especially commercial and proprietary routers that expose like SSH functionality. I would definitely want to look into those implementations and figure it out. Also, hopefully, obviously, I would be less concerned about SSH functionality turned on in something like TrueNAS or OpenSense router, something like that, because the odds are extremely good that when there's a full Linux or FreeBSD distribution behind a more complex project that frequently runs on full x86 hardware, it's probably just going to be running OpenSSH out of the repo, and so again, not vulnerable.
Yeah, based on how some of the companies responded to this, like Zyzel saying the flaw only affects its end-of-life firmware and that by that point they had begun using a not vulnerable OpenSSL. I'm wondering if some of them were using some of the smaller embedded SSL libraries, and that's where the flaw came from, or just various things they did to try to deal with the fact that really small devices have a hard time coming up with enough randomness, and that's actually where the flaw was kind of coming from. So Cisco says they fixed their ASA and FTD software back in 2022 and are investigating mitigations for older iOS and iOS XE software.
Note, of course, that back in 22 is not that long ago. So
no.
Yeah, if you're not intimately aware of the last time that you patched your Cisco gear that exposes SSH functionality, you should probably look into that.
They also expect that the same problem may also apply to IPsec, but they say given the rarity of vulnerable signature faults, we've not been able to conclude much about IPsec implementations from our data and believe this question deserves further study.
Don't you hate it when the movie ends with a teaser for the sequel they haven't dropped yet?
Yes, very much so. It's like, IPsec, it's maybe okay, maybe not. Wait and see our next paper.
Like and subscribe for more great content like this, essentially.
Don't forget to get the bell on.
Yeah.
Let's do some feedback then. Matthew sent us a link to an article called The Beauty of Finished Software and said finished software is how he views FreeBSD and ZFS and why he uses both. And this is kind of your usual Luddite-ish take on how software is just constantly developed for the sake of it, and how sometimes you should just call it finished.
I do agree with the premise in general, for the most part, but I would like to point out that his selection of examples is just wildly wrong. Neither FreeBSD nor ZFS are even close to being finished projects.
Yeah, I mean, Alan, you're working on adding a major feature to ZFS.
Yeah, usually one or two of them at a time, solidly for the last 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, ZFS is great, but there's certainly features it could do with.
Mm-hmm. And for example, RAID Z expansion finally got added last week.
And reflink copies. Oh, reflink copies.
Yeah, and FreeBSD, I mean, that's getting new features all the time as well, isn't it?
Yep. FreeBSD 14.0 will come out sometime between when we're recording this and when this gets published.
So yeah, not great examples, but I agree with Jim. There's some things. I mean, look, CD, LS, they're finished software at this point.
Go look at the git changelog for the LS utility on both BSD and Linux. Whether it's a good thing or not is maybe a different conversation. But just between episodes, Joe, you and I were talking about Thunderbird.
Yeah.
And how at some point I was just like, it works exactly how I want. I understand it still needs maintenance. And like when I had to grow OAuth 2 support so you could have two-factor login for your email and so on, that was good. But sometimes I feel like they're doing a UI refresh just to move all the buttons around and screw up my muscle memory. And I wish they would stop it.
Well, you're getting into stuff like GNOME, for example. GNOME 2 was this beautifully finished piece of software. And they decided, no, throw that all out and let's have GNOME Shell, GNOME 3, and just do it completely differently. Thankfully, Mate was spawned as a fork and has continued developing and is somewhat modern. But yeah, sometimes developers going to develop, basically.
There's a really unfortunate and very endemic habit in the software development world of thinking of pretty massive UI changes as being akin to a fresh coat of paint. Because, I mean, it's still basically the same app, right? But, you know, now things look different. Like, it's fresh. And now you have this visual confirmation that, like, oh, this is new and shiny, and that's old and busted. And to the developer, it makes the new thing seem more appealing. And to be fair to a lot of consumers, it does have the same effect. You see a lot of people who, frankly, hunger for, like, different new interfaces. And a lot of the time, you'll hear somebody gush about a new interface, and it will be clear that, okay, yes, they're enjoying it, but they're not really enjoying it because it's better. They're just enjoying it because it's different, and they like that, and it gets them interested in the thing all over again. However, you also have, you know, folks like, I suspect all three of us on this podcast who are like, once it works, stop dicking with it. If you want to add a genuinely new feature that needs a genuinely new control, okay, if adding that genuinely new control means you need to rearrange some things because it doesn't work in the current layout, probably okay. But if you're just like, oh, well, you know, new reskin, and let's try this thing over there and that thing over there, and we'll just move that there, and we'll just change this workflow to this over here. And no, man, stop it. Don't do that without like extensive conversations with your user base at first, at least.
Alan, you're still using Windows 10 wherever you can, right?
Yeah, because same thing. It's like, don't change anything while I'm using it. It's like, I will build a new computer and make the switch then and deal with all the trauma at once. But for now, it's like, I don't like to reboot because my windows might be in a different order when I reopen them all.
Yeah, and you still haven't got over the changes Red Hat made.
Yeah. Like I learned how to do Red Hat admin in college 20 years ago, and that knowledge served me great all the way up through CentOS 6. And then with 7, they did the whole systemd thing, and I'm just like, I don't understand any of this anymore. Make it go away.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by the Traceroute Podcast. With the rise of AI, technology is starting to seem more human, and that's causing some mixed feelings in the humans who use it. Check out Season 3 of the Traceroute Podcast. It's a show that explores the people who shape our digital world and how technology is changing society. The new season of Traceroute is already tackling questions like, why do we talk to AI but not to our toasters and cars? And how long does it take to become best friends with AI? In every episode of Traceroute, expert technologists peel back the layers of the stack to reveal the humanity in the hardware. Season 3 has explored our love-hate relationship with AI, and there's so much more to come, like this week's episode on the intersectional roles of tech evangelists, developer advocates, and tech influencers. Who really influences what technology gets made? Who exactly drives tech innovation is something that's really interesting to me, so I look forward to listening to that one. So get keyed into the conversation today. Listen and subscribe to the new season of Traceroute on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check out Traceroute now. Let's do some free consulting then, but first just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Christian says, I have a TP-Link Armada-based network at home. 3 access points, a switch, and a router, very basic. I would like to add a bunch of Ethernet security cameras around the house, but unfortunately, I have no way to route the Ethernet cables. Focusing on one location specifically, there is mid-quality Wi-Fi reach and power available. In terms of general network performance, is it better to use a Wi-Fi camera or use a pair of powerline adapters with a cable camera?
Well, so generally when you're talking about powerline versus Wi-Fi, the first trade-off that you're talking about is latency versus throughput. Typically, you're going to see tremendously higher throughput from Wi-Fi in good conditions, and you'll see tremendously lower latency from powerline in decent to good conditions. Basically, powerline is always going to give you near Ethernet latency unless there's something going on in your house's electrical system that makes it nearly unusable, which unfortunately is a thing. So if you've never used powerline in your house before, you should always keep in mind that the first pair of adapters you do, you need to be ready to return them, because if powerline doesn't work in your house, it's not going to work in your house. And short of 5 figures paid to an electrician and a few weeks or possibly months of dealing with them tearing out the walls and replacing everything, that's not going to change.
Well, I used to record these shows with Wi-Fi for years, and then the day I got Powerline, we got on the call with the video, and Jim, you said, you've got the Powerline adapters, haven't you? You could tell instantly from my video quality.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, Joe did not have great Wi-Fi in that case.
Yeah.
It was not mid.
No, it was not mid. But even when somebody does have good Wi-Fi, I could almost always tell when somebody was on Wi-Fi. Like when I was working for Ars Technica, it was like a new Zoom call every day, just about. And when folks are on Wi-Fi, you notice that their latency is considerably higher. You cannot easily tell just from looking at somebody's Zoom video whether they're wired, with proper wired Ethernet or over powerline, because you're still going to be talking about typically under 1 millisecond latency, which is, it's the same thing that you're getting with Ethernet. Yes, it will be slightly higher amounts of less than 1 millisecond, but with Wi-Fi, you're frequently going to be seeing local latency times, with tens of milliseconds. Now, it won't do that while the network is almost entirely idle, but as the network gets busier, your latency is going to go shooting way up with Wi-Fi. And that's actually why, yes, you probably should be looking at doing powerline for this. It's not necessarily about the connection quality to those specific cameras. It's a case of this is an opportunity for you not to, lard up your overall general Wi-Fi network with the constant stream of traffic that those cameras are going to generate. And so that will have, some not insignificant follow-on nice effects for everything else that you're using your Wi-Fi for.
Yeah, I think the Powerline has the main advantage of being more consistent. Like Jim said, the latency was lower, but even if it wasn't lower, it being the same all the time is much easier for applications to deal with than Wi-Fi, where it can jump up and down constantly based on what everybody else in the neighborhood is doing in the air.
Now, the other thing that I will mention, part of this guarantee of like really consistent, really low latency, it is based around the idea that you've really only got 1 or 2 things using Powerline in your whole house. Because the thing that people tend to get wrong about Powerline is they think, oh, well, it's Ethernet over my Powerline. It's really not. It's actually Wi-Fi over your Powerlines. Now, you can find lots of technical quibbles about that. The protocol is not exactly the same, but it's very, very close to being just Wi-Fi using your power lines rather than using the open air. And it has similar considerations, meaning the more devices you have, because it is a single duplex, non-switched, one collision domain for the whole thing. If you've got 30 devices plugged into Powerline in your house, it's going to suck just like having 30 devices on Wi-Fi in your house would.
But you've already got 30 Wi-Fi devices in your house, probably, especially if you've got kids.
Exactly. So it's giving you a new collision domain that doesn't impact on all your Wi-Fi stuff and is relatively, nice and neat and clean and doesn't change and isn't going to be subject to a lot of outside interference. It is possible now, and this is part of why I said, you kind of need to test your own environment. If you have the wrong appliances or the wrong gear or the wrong wiring problems in your house, it can be noisy and suck absolutely all the time. That'll be difficult to fix. You could also just have one heavy appliance that does something really ugly periodically. Maybe a refrigerator with coils not in the best condition, and every time the motor kicks on, like it makes enough noise in the power line that it interrupts, networking periodically, and maybe you see higher latency or whatever. But again, these days, these kinds of issues are pretty uncommon and unusual. They can happen. You should be aware, but it's not something you should be thinking, oh, well, that's definitely going to happen to me, so I shouldn't even bother checking this stuff out.
So it sounds like if you had one camera to add, then Powerline is definitely the answer. But Christian says he has a bunch of them.
Yeah, but I think if he's talking about as many as he can count on his two hands, is probably still better than Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi will continue to have even more problems as you add more cameras.
Yes, and Christian specifically said that he's asking about one location specifically with mid-quality Wi-Fi reach and power. Is it better to use a Wi-Fi camera or use a pair of Powerline adapters with a cable camera for that location? And again, assuming there's no unusual issues in the power environment, I don't think there's any question the Powerline adapter is going to be a better answer for that.
Yeah. The biggest thing there definitely is by saving the airtime on your Wi-Fi, not only is it better for the camera, but you're not shitting up the RF spectrum for the rest of your house.
The other thing that I have forgotten to mention so far, and I try to always make a point of mentioning anytime I answer anybody's questions about Powerline, if you're thinking about dipping your toes in this, make sure you read the instructions and encrypt the connection. By default, most Powerline gear will not have encrypted the connection. Even when it says on the box, fully encrypted connections, there's usually like a little setup process that works kind of like pairing Bluetooth devices does, particularly for IoT grade stuff. It may just boil down to, push one button on each device while they're both plugged in, and hold it down for a couple of seconds. And then after that, like the color on your little LED changes and everything's encrypted. You might think that without doing that, they just won't pass data at all, but that's not the case. They will absolutely establish network with no encryption whatsoever, and you might think, well, do I really care about that? And the answer is yes, you really do, because if your neighbor also buys a pair of Powerline adapters and also doesn't bother doing the little encryption routine, before you know it, you will have bridged networks between your houses, and I have personally accidentally reconfigured somebody else's router that way and had to go around my neighborhood knocking on doors trying to figure out who I'd screwed over.
I had not considered that. Yeah, that's just one big hub.
I hadn't considered it either until I found myself knocking on my next door neighbor's house and asking, is your Wi-Fi name There Be Cats? And it turned out he had no idea because it was his son's Wi-Fi name, and also he was a little hard of hearing, and he said, no, I'm divorced, and started to close the door on me. And yes, it was him.
Now I want a device that goes at my circuit breaker panel that filters out Powerline Ethernet.
Well, a lot of people mistakenly believe that your electrical meter already does that, and it does not. It absolutely does make it far poorer quality. I would not be happy about, trying to deliberately move data across Powerline connection in between two houses. But again, I literally had started reconfiguring this guy's router and got some distance with it before I figured out something was wrong. So no, it wasn't the best quality connection, but it is not so bad that you're just immediately going to be like, oh, well, this is hinky and weird, and you may have no idea what's going on. And you might not be me in this analogy. You might be the innocent neighbor.
Now I'm wondering about times in my childhood where this might have been useful. I remember actually, running an Ethernet cable out my bedroom window to my neighbor's house. It's if we could have just used Powerline Ethernet, maybe that would have worked.
The Powerline Ethernet from back then would not have worked. Yeah. It barely worked in your own house, let alone bridging a meter. That's another thing that's probably worth mentioning, for you fellow old heads out there that may remember early Powerline kit from the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. This is not the same grade of equipment we're talking about. You can reasonably expect in, most houses with, let's say, mid-1980s and up construction, you're typically going to be expecting anywhere from 20 to 80 megabits of throughput from one end of the house to the other. With AV2000 gear, I would strongly recommend TP-Link only. All the other manufacturers are basically just taking a reference design and running with it, whereas TP-Link is actually optimizing their powerline kit. They seem to be the only one that really care enough to do that, and the difference absolutely does show up when you test them head-to-head.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.